Many Dark Souls players tend to point out the good aspects of the game, some elements that make it so compelling. However, just a few actually delve into an aesthetic analysis of why its lore resonates so deeply. So today, I will explore the aesthetic that underlies most of the questlines found in the later part of the game, aiming to reveal the rhetoric of madness that emerges as a central theme in Dark Souls. When encountering Souls-like games, most YouTube channels tend to label them as nihilistic, yet for some reason, they rarely explain what kind of nihilism is being presented, or which specific elements make the game evoke such a sensation. Using Dark Souls Remastered as an example, we can observe that the theme of madness underlies the main questlines. Characters often meet tragic ends across most of their possible narrative outcomes. However, what is seldom addressed is why these characters go mad, or what this descending to madness signifies in aesthetic terms. In Dark Souls, each character follows a personal journey, a pursuit of knowledge, but this knowledge is never presented as an absolute, rather it is filtered through aesthetic expression. Take the character Solaire for instance. His relationship with the sun is entirely aesthetic. He doesn't merely admire it, he aestheticizes it to the point of obsession, attempting to grasp its essence as if it were a tangible thing. Since this is impossible, he gradually begins to lose his sanity. It is possible to prevent his complete descent into madness, but the tension between appearance and truth and existential reality drives him towards psychological collapse. By declaring that the sun is a magnificent father, he expressed the comfort he finds in contemplating the ever-shining sun, and when he says, quote-unquote, "If only I could be so grossly incandescent," he is essentially confessing a desire to embody the aesthetic ideal he sees in the sun, to become, in a sense, its very essence, radiant, life-giving, and secure. This may seem like a small detail, but this obsessive longing to possess the thing in itself, and the confusion between aesthetic and surface, and ontological truth is a philosophical current that permeates the entire game. It is precisely this pattern of thoughts that reappears in other characters, as well as driven by different motivations, as in the case of Lord Gwyn. For example, in the aesthetic of Lord Gwyn, that is neither passive nihilism nor nihilism in the negative sense. He constantly strives to keep the flame alive. The eternal act of sacrificing himself to sustain the flame is a tragic, yet affirmative act. In fact, it represents an aesthetic overcoming of nihilism, which is symbolized by the will toward emptiness. Therefore, if this distinction is not made explicit, one ends up misinterpreting the game's underlying philosophy, which means reducing it to something overly simplistic. With this in mind, we can begin to examine each variant of madness in the game, uncovering the specific motivations and ambitions that fuel them. When it comes to analyzing madness, Big Hat Logan stood out the most to me. Even in a world full of madness, where you find charismatic figures like Solaire and deeply tragic ones like Lord Gwyn, whose melancholy theme still echoes in my mind, it's almost amusing how his questlines feel like one of the longest in the game. I imagine I've completed several, yet I don't recall another that stretched quite this far. Perhaps Sigmaier's, but his doesn't feel long since we meet him at key, well-paced points throughout the game. Logan's, however, felt different. It required detours that went against the more direct routes toward the main objectives, and completing it was far from easy. While his dialogue may not be particularly profound, Logan clearly represents the archetype of the wise man driven mad by his insatiable thirst for knowledge. He was apparently trapped while trying to reach Anor Londo, presumably in search of the Duck's archives and their vast, seemingly infinite source of knowledge, yet ends up stuck in Zan's fortress. In a sense, when the player attempts to complete his questline within the archives, they are reenacting that same trajectory, the pursuit of ultimate knowledge, and in return, they are rewarded. His spells are arguably the most powerful in the entire game, and when measured by cost efficiency, they are very good. They practically grant you a free pass into endless cycles of New Game Plus, But aesthetically, this all represents the paradox of knowledge. We seek a kind of ultimate understanding, Yet we become trapped and enslaved the moment we attempt to possess that knowledge as a thing in itself, as something eternal, unmediated, and absolute. Madness then emerges as a result of this very contradiction. The same tragic pattern can be seen in the ambitions of other characters, such as Sith's fatal obsession with immortality, or the Witch of Izalith's attempt to create an artificial flame. Strangely enough, these ambitions exist in our own world too. Whenever we attempt to create idealized, artificial versions of reality, colored in absolute tones, this generates not beauty, but anti-aesthetic and madness. We know, of course, that this is only an aesthetic interpretation. In fact, we cannot own the sun, or become immortal, or forge a perfect and eternal copy of anything. And from this impossibility, the theme of the corrupted self arises within these quest lines. The tragic hero Artorias, also known as the Abyss Walker, is one of the characters who most fully embodies the aesthetic of Dark Souls, despite belonging to the DLC. The aesthetic behind Artorias managed to bring together most of the elements necessary for what could be considered the sublime of the game. This alone motivated me to complete the game multiple times and to undertake the slow process of entering the DLC again and again. That said, from an aesthetic standpoint, the hero is ultimately corrupted by his own heroism. Even though the game frames this as corruption by the Abyss, we can interpret the fate of the tragic hero as precisely that, to meet his downfall through his own idealism. Heroism, in its purest form, inevitably consumes itself, and yet this is exactly what makes it so captivating. It ensures that your name will be remembered years later, in a completely different age. Many understood this and longed for such a fate. Artorias' aesthetic conveys this not only through his lore and character design, but also through his entirely unique and unpredictable fighting style. Even his greatsword becomes a kind of character of its own, a final object of that compelling aesthetic representing the fatal values of honor and heroism. If we were to compare the aesthetic of Artorias with that of Solaire, we would see that they are not so far apart. Both are expressions, different manifestations and motivations of the same heroic instinct. Solaire's is a personal and subjective realization, and Artorias is an external realization that nonetheless remains subjective. As his heroic accomplishment becomes entangled with himself, leading to both corruption and symbolism, Artorias is the tragic fulfillment of the ultimate consequences of pursuing the heroic ideal. Solaire, in the other hand, is the fulfillment of personal heroism, a personal legend, a myth, radiant from within, a light of one's own making. In this way, both can be considered variants of the same ambition, and in the world of Dark Souls, its ultimate realization is always tragic. Together with Lord Gwyn, Artorias stands as one of the pillars of the blind pursuit of the ideal. In this case, the idea of continued heroic action carried out until the inevitable corruption, just as Gwyn became blinded and corrupted, confusing his own will with that of the flame he sought to keep alive. And with that, we conclude this aesthetic analysis of madness in Dark Souls. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see in the next video.